Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today we have a roundtable. We have myself, Dr. Pack, and Milo Wolf, and we are discussing essentially the extremes that we see within the use of science and also, I guess, the hate against science. And I kind of frame these as like the PubMed warrior and then the kind of bro scientist, and then looking to kind of bring these people together, see that there's a gray area and a middle ground that ultimately will breed evidence-based practice, and some of the ways that you can use science to your favor, and also as a consumer of science, how you can kind of see the red flags of people who should be very well educated and spreading a good message, but maybe use it to their advantage and kind of deceive in many ways. So we kind of jumped through this discussion and I think it was really valuable. Also talking about if you are considering further education, higher education in terms of PhD, whether or not that is a choice that you may want to make or may not want to make, talking about the pros and cons. So this was a really fun chat. As always, guys, if you do enjoy this, please share it with others, subscribe, like it, give us a comment, give us a review on the podcast platform that you're on. We always appreciate that and we want the podcast to grow and flourish. But without further ado, let's get into the chat. Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. Today we have a roundtable, I guess, a discussion between two fellow, well, one soon to be, I guess, with Milo PhD and a fellow PhD, not a fellow PhD because I don't have a PhD. We're going to continue rolling this intro even though I've pretty much screwed it up, but we have Dr. Pack and we have Milo Wolf back on the show, both of who have been on the show recently. Pack was talking about deloads with me, and obviously Milo has been talking about lots of kind of range of motion in regards to impacts on muscle hypertrophy. But today we're going to take a different spin, and that is related to PhDs, which is why I brought it up. And that is kind of this, you kind of have some crowds within the fitness industry, I think, where you have the guys who are like the PubMed warriors, I guess they would be called. And then you have the kind of anti-science crowd, maybe like the bro science, kind of team bro science, whatever it might be. And I think both Milo and Pack have done a good job of kind of trying to find a middle ground to that and explain what that looks like to each side of those, and realize like there shouldn't really be these camps, more so that kind of gray area that we should all exist within to kind of get best outcomes. We'll probably dig into a little bit of what your experience has been like as well, getting your PhDs, and how useful you think that might be to someone who is kind of considering it as well, if they're looking to get into, I guess it depends on many things, on whether or not you'd advise someone to go down that route. But I don't know, Pack, if we start with you, talking about these kind of extreme stances and this kind of worshipping of science versus kind of ignoring it, and where you feel like people should be heading.
Yeah, I think it, the whole idea of camps kind of stems back from the early evidence-based days, when being evidence-based and looking at science, when science, especially in our field, was somewhat scarce, was like a revolutionary new thing, especially with things like if it fits your macros and certain training adjustments as well. And that sort of created the idea that it's either, you're either science-based or you're not. You're either the extreme, if it fits your macros, sort of looking at studies and adjusting your training based on them archetype, or you're the, hey, just train hard and eat clean, bro archetype. But at the same time, and especially in 2023, I think that being in either side of the spectrum doesn't make sense, and you're essentially doing a disservice to yourself, because there are limitations to just relying solely on experience as your main source of data, or the main source that informs your training or your dieting decisions, and vice versa. Relying solely on science or scientific data, to be more appropriate, also comes in with its own limitations. And yeah, we often see freaks on both sides of the spectrum, because science is something that is not perfect and is not meant to be the answer, but rather a step closer to the truth. And if you haven't either gotten a degree, and I would say if you haven't gotten a degree under the right supervision and with the right mentors, you may not necessarily fully understand that. And if you haven't actually read research and analyzed research critically, you may also be under the illusion that, hey, a paper says this and that, therefore that's the truth, and it's perfect. So, and then on the other hand, we have people who will have sort of a knee-jerk reaction to anything that is slightly unorthodox or changes the way we've thought about things, and will just completely push science away and say, hey, we don't care about that. That was done in whatever, untrained individuals, or yeah, I'm 100-kilo experienced lifter, that doesn't apply to me, or yeah, why are you overcomplicating this, and we shouldn't be really overanalyzing things. But as far as approaching training and nutrition goes, you should let both science and your own experience, or both personal and professional, if you're a coach, you should let both of those things inform your practice. I'm now freestyling, and I'm just saying words to just keep thinking about stuff, but I think that's all I had to say there.
No, I liked it. And I think the examples are like the extreme, if it fits your macros, and then the guys coming from clean eating. It kind of describes where I was, where my first kind of like getting into the nutritional practice was just like high protein, clean diet. That's the way to go. And I did that for years. And then I started learning more about macros, and so if it fits your macros, I was like, no, I can't be doing that. Surely not, because you're so dogmatic, even in the ways that's kind of got you results, that you don't want to see this kind of thing that maybe looks easier or different or is slightly uncomfortable and challenges your beliefs. But then I slowly incorporated it, and I was like, that was probably my first like slight evidence-based kind of change to what I was doing in terms of like focus on macros versus just kind of clean foods. And I'm actually interested. I don't know if this is not necessarily a question I thought I had in mind, but for Milo, and then maybe we'll go to Pac, what drew you to, I guess, evidence-based or science-based kind of, what drew you that direction? Because I think it's always interesting when I think about an archetype for like the PubMed warrior, think about like a kind of skinny kid behind a keyboard who's like, I don't know, that forever intermediate or whatever, like to be as mean as possible. And then you have like the bro scientist, like he's jacked, like he trains hard, but like clearly maybe not that intellectual. So I'm interested because I mean, both of you lift weights.
We try.
I didn't wear the glasses, and I wore a t-shirt specifically to avoid to have that there.
Yeah, so for me, I was that kid that you mentioned, the skinny kid who wasn't making any gains. So I think that partly drew me to it. Ultimately, I think what kind of made me stick with science over, say, more anecdotal evidence, let's say, is that ultimately science is a very, very powerful tool. To use a bad metaphor, it's kind of like fire. You know, it has its risks, it has its dangers. You can misuse it and it can cause harm, right? But at the same time, it can be used for a lot of useful applications. So for me, it was a matter of, well, if I try and apply certain techniques that get recommended to me in the gym or by other people to myself, it's really fucking difficult to tell whether or not something worked or didn't, right? If we're talking about the effect, for example, of a certain exercise on results, how do you measure the results? Let's say it's muscle growth, right? Do you measure muscle circumference, like using a tape measurement? How do you measure that? How do you assess the impact of a certain training change or doing more sets or doing a different exercise or what have you on your results? That can be extremely challenging. And in addition to that, if you do just look at yourself, you are prone to bias ultimately. I'm not saying science isn't, but science can help minimize some of these issues as much as possible. And that also means that you don't have to go blindly on your own personal experience or a few people's individual experiences to make broader recommendations, right? If you're talking about the average person and what might work for them, you're much better off going off studies that actually look at relatively average people. Does that mean that there aren't cases where if you're dealing with genetic outliers or extremely high performers, there are certain things that might work there that wouldn't work in studies? Absolutely. There are going to be cases like that. And that's potentially where some of the limitations of science come in. But I think that science helps minimize noise, for example, right? Like if you make one change in your training, you're likely also going to be changing a lot of other things at the same time, just because you think, oh, this thing might work and that thing might work. And that introduces so much noise into your results and into your training that it becomes really difficult to infer causality within your training. Oh, I changed this exercise and thus saw growth. It's very difficult to tell that, especially because we're talking about small differences in likelihood. You know, you're not going to see revolutionary lat growth from changing from underhand pull downs to overhand pull downs. certainly on the scale of one person, you're not going to be able to tell, especially with the means of assessing progress that you have at your disposal as an individual. Like, ultimately, what do you have? Looking at pictures? Is that even reliable? Is that even accurate as a means of looking at hypertrophy? I don't know.
Wait, you mean to say that the adding SLDLs instead of Romanian deadlifts is not what led to my back growing significantly more?
Significantly, hey, big words. That's another thing, is that science can easily be misinterpreted. So, for example, for people who haven't really been around too much evidence or have read too much evidence, they can quickly, for example, overinterpret the results of one study and be highly confident in whether or not those would extrapolate to the real world, or whether those results would replicate in another study, and that sort of stuff. So I think there's a lot of pitfalls with science, but ultimately it has also a lot of advantages over just using your own personal experience, or even looking at the personal experience of a few individuals or high performers, because ultimately they're different people from you, and there are bigger factors at play than, for example, the exercises being used or what have you. Like, genuinely, the impact of genetics alone on results is likely larger than any difference in training, pretty much. Like, as long as you're within a wide range of training variables, like, for example, doing between, say, 5 and 20 sets per week, genetics far outweighs the impact of, say, 5 sets versus 15 sets a week. So even looking at a few individual experiences, it's not going to be enough to tell shit about how the average person responds to that. You know?
Can I add something? Sorry, Steve. I think there's also an issue with the word science in itself, because many bros or many people who lift and are, hardcore lifters, when they hear science, they imagine some undergraduate student in a lab doing like a one arm sort of curl weird study design and getting biopsies and doing something that is completely different to what they're doing in the field. But for example, in the study that I'm helping out now here at Lehman College, they're just taking people, putting them through extremely hard lower body sessions, taking them to failure, doing deep squats, doing leg extensions, doing calf exercises, and they're just then seeing if that if a deload will have an effect on them. But their training is essentially super hard training that you'd also do in the real world, but it's just a bunch of people doing the same thing and then seeing if that works. But I think sometimes people will be like, oh yeah, it's just a study on the isokinetic dynamometer where they put a couple of or a handful of untrained individuals, and they think that that's all there is to science, when in reality, even some of our studies are essentially real world training, just in a more controlled environment.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think a lot of people, especially those who are slightly on the anti-science kind of side, they think that's what they envisage like the training studies to look like, and in reality it's not always that way. And like you said, it's not perfect, but it's better than like just picking like random anecdotes, because like you said, Milo, genetics play a huge role. And then when you don't even consider drugs, which a lot, and including naturals, will get their kind of training decisions informed, or their nutritional decisions through like assisted athletes who aren't scientifically based and they are more so on just anecdote and like what worked for them. It's like, well, dude, like whatever you're injecting is having larger effect sizes than the training that you're doing, just like you said with the genetics, and that's a dangerous place to be. Pac, were you also that kind of skinny, nerdy kid that kind of wasn't getting results, or did your route to science, was that a little bit different?
No, it's I've been skinny maybe for like a year in my life, and that was after I lost a lot of weight. I was a chubby kid, but my road to science, I think, and maybe similar to yours, and this is something that we've also talked about with Milo and others in the field, is that I came up as a quote unquote bro. I started lifting with a close friend of mine at school. It was all training to failure, and then I just started reading in an attempt to better my own training. And I saw that, oh, okay, cool. It makes sense to also look at what the science has to say and what people that are educated and have actually studied the behind the scenes of muscle growth and strength, I have to say. So it made sense to me to better inform my training, not just using what some guy in the gym said, but also looking at the scientific evidence. And then I slowly got into the to studying and pursuing an undergraduate degree and so on and so forth. But it wasn't, I never made a 180 turn where I went, oh, okay, gym, science. I still, listen to people in the gym or other coaches, but it just made sense to combine both and potentially place a bit more emphasis on the science side of things. Because things like training frequency or training volume, you're not looking at what the scientific evidence has to say carries more weight than what some guy will tell you based on his experience, which is just observing. And that's the irony there. People will always hate on observational data when it comes to science, but then it's like, oh, but that coach has worked with so many athletes and he has observed this. And I'm like, okay, right, the confounding variables and the noise there is just way too much to even jump to a conclusion like that.
Yeah, and I think one thing I want to mention is one interesting thing that people often do is dichotomize anecdote and study, essentially, like an anecdote versus anecdotes and data from a study. Ultimately, they are kind of the same thing, but with a few key differences, right? In the case of anecdotes, we're talking about observations, and we're also talking about observations in the case of data in the study. The difference is that in the case of a study, the researchers are trying their best to minimize confounding variables. With anecdotes, people are usually not really trying to minimize confounding variables and noise and variance between people. Moreover, not only do scientists try and minimize confounding variables, which then allows you to have greater certainty around how big of an effect does something have, how likely is it to actually have an effect, but also they actually try and look at as many people as they can for as long of a time period as they can. And that gives you a lot more certainty about how much of an effect does this have. How likely is it to be a true effect and not just noise? Whereas if we're talking about anecdotes, oftentimes we're talking about what Dorian did. Ultimately, that is one person. That is a relatively short time frame, and there are a lot of confounders. And so I think it's important not to completely dichotomize data from science and anecdotes, but it's important to recognize that data from studies and from science is generally just way higher quality. So unless you have a huge amount of anecdotes that support a certain thing, tightly controlled data from studies will provide you with a more robust estimate of how big of an effect does something have, and a more robust degree of confidence in whether or not that actually exists.
Sorry, we're now monopolizing this, but you mentioned Dorian, and I want to say this on air. So this is from a Dorian Yates post about his back growth, and he says, I typically perform pullovers, strength pull downs, barbell or dumbbell rows, cable rows, and then deadlifts or hyperextensions. And this is for the deadlifts for back growth crowd. Sorry, had to be done. Had to be said on air.
So he needed the deadlifts there at the end of his session.
But he said either deadlifts or hyperextensions, as long as you're hitting your erectors some way, and that's been what Milo and I have been talking about quite a bit. Anyways, I digress.
Literally for years we've had this discussion because we keep seeing it, and then we just kept hating on it because it doesn't make a ton of sense.
No, I know. For every because I see it very commonly where it will be said like, oh, when the guys turn to the back of the stage, the judges will know who deadlifts. And me and Pascal literally just said this today in the improvement season. I was like, for the number of for every guy that deadlifts who turns to the back, there'd be another guy who has a terrible back and no density within his back that also deadlifts. And there'd be another guy who doesn't deadlift and has an amazing back and like huge thick glutes and erectors. It's like, it's not just the deadlift. Like there's so many other things going on there. You
could be a proficient good morninger.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, Steve, I think you should just accept that success leaves clues, ultimately. And I think that's where you probably don't want to be on either end of the extreme, right? If you adopt that stance of exclusively success leaves clues, or, the people doing their deadlifts, it'll show on stage, we'll be able to tell them apart. If you take that extreme of a stance, you're definitely missing out on a lot of stuff. Likewise, though, if you misinterpret science and only look at science, you will also fall into some wacky positions, right? Like, especially if there's limited evidence on a topic, but you're not super well versed in interpreting science, you may think, oh, there's been one study on this topic, for example, a supplement, right? Like, I'm pretty sure there's a new supplement out there right now with a Latin name that I can't even pronounce, that has a couple studies showing an increased testosterone. And it's the sort of thing where if you don't really know how science works, you might be tempted to say, oh, well, I like the idea of science. I don't really know how this works, but let me base my understanding on a topic on just one study and apply this to my training. And if you do that, you may actually end up in a kind of similar position to a lot of bros in the gym, where they apply a lot of gimmicks that get recommended to them and without really giving it much thought first. You might use this supplement because it has one study behind it. You might use this technique in your training because it has one study behind it that kind of showed it did something. And I remember talking to bros in the gym like 5 years ago, and they would tell me what supplements they were taking, and they were just taking fucking everything, And I think if you misinterpret science, ironically enough, you end up in a similar place.
It's a really good point in terms of the limitations of Anecdote. You kind of said this, where the number of times you'll speak to someone in the gym and they'll be like, oh, I did this one thing and it blew me up or whatever. And quite often it's supplements. Like, that used to always be the thing. Everyone would just ask, like, any jack dude, oh, so what supplements are you taking? Like, completely forgetting about the importance of sleep, nutrition, training, like, what supplements? Because clearly that's the thing that's doing it. And a lot of people actually think like, oh yeah, I took this one pre-workout or whatever it is. It's like, my session was just so much better. It's like, it wasn't like the 8-9 hours of sleep you got the night before, or like the carbs you had pre-workout, or like these other details and factors. Like, we're so poor at knowing what caused what to happen to our physique and body because there are so many confounders. And that's why you need something like science to be like, actually, it was that. So you could have someone like Dorian, who, I'm not saying he said this, but he might be like, oh yeah, my back was built through deadlifts. It's like, well, you're saying that, but actually you don't know that was the thing that was doing it for you there.
It's especially amusing with supplements because there is data showing that with commonly available supplements by not super trustworthy companies, the dosage is actually very far beyond what the label says. So you may actually be like misdosing it and claiming that you still get good results, like you might be underdosing it. But also sometimes there can be contamination, even with PDs. So at that point, you're talking about not just noise from training variables and nutrition variables and sleep variables, etc. You're also talking about noise from the supplement itself, which is a bit of a mindfuck to think about.
Yeah. At the same time, a lot of the bros that will tell you, "Hey, I did this and it worked." It's like they're also doing all the absolute basics and fundamentals absolutely right. So they're sleeping well, they're either in a calorie surplus, or at least they're eating well for their respective goal. They're training with a very high intensity of effort, and they're performing a variety of exercises with relatively good technique, whatever that means. So it's like, it's very, and that's where science comes in, and it can help you to actually know whether that one thing that you changed made a difference, because there will be a group of people that will be doing will be following a very controlled training program with just that one variable manipulated. So yeah, it's crazy. We see that in the gym that we go to in Southampton with Milo as well, where, there's guys there that are very enthusiastic about training, but not necessarily enthusiastic about learning about training, which I don't get. And again, that I came up that way. I was somebody who just loved training, wanted to learn more about my own training. And it's like, they're training super hard, they're doing a bunch of volume. They will, add bands to something, or do like a certain type of drop set or special sort of Maya rep, whatever set. And it's like, yeah, man, this has been working really well. And I'm like, can you really say that? But at the end, does it really matter? That's then I'm going to throw a wrench here and say, hey, if the placebo effect is strong enough and they're pushing their training hard, I would not advise against it. But at the same time, making a recommendation based off your own experience and presenting it as, yeah, this is hard data, I think that's also wrong and can mislead a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that's where I was thinking about these anecdotes and how can people use, like, listening or just seeing other people training, how can we kind of use that to our benefit in a more scientific kind of way? And I tend to think of like, okay, so look at these 10 jack dudes, what are they all doing that's somewhat similar? Like, what principles maybe can I draw from what they're doing here? And like you draw back to the scientific principles of like, right, we need to be doing enough work, hard enough, for long enough, recovering and eating. And it's like, okay, so the specific nuances, you can't tie those away from those anecdotes, and then maybe science can draw some of those for us.
Yeah, and it's funny as well because to go back to the dichotomy between anecdotes and data from studies, nowadays there are a few weirdos who are trying to kind of bridge that gap on the spectrum. So I'm thinking of Eric Helms and Brian Borstein, who are doing the sort of like, for example, Brian Borstein is only training one arm directly and has been doing so for 6 months now, and seeing if there's any results. Obviously, the measurement method of hypertrophy may not be ideal. And with Eric Helms, I think he's doing the stretch protocol from the Warnicki study, where he's having one of his calves be stretched for 1 hour a day, I think for a long time, actually. I think he's been doing this for a while now, unless he's gotten the results back already. And yeah, it's interesting to see that there's people out there nowadays who are kind of trying to find a middle ground between the anecdote and data from evidence. Obviously, we're still talking about n=1, so it's not great, but it is interesting to see. And I guess that's the sort of situation where, because you have another limb to compare it to, so for example, comparing the left calf to the right calf, you can actually draw, at least about yourself, a decent inference, right? Like if, for example, for Brian, only training one arm, he saw no difference at all over 6 months, and the rest of his training remains similar, like as in, same compounds for everything, etc. He can probably draw a decent inference about himself that direct arm work at this point in his career, if there's no change, for example, between the two arms, may not actually grow him much, or at least not detectably, which that's kind of a key point, because depending on the measurement method, it might be difficult to detect small changes, especially this deep into a training career. But it is interesting that nowadays you could do that, but then it's the sort of thing where there is the opportunity cost of instead doing what you think is best already based on the evidence. And that's where evidence can come in handy, right? Because it doesn't leave you to figure out what works on yourself over time. It cuts out that experimentation and trial and error that you would otherwise have to go through. Like, for example, in this case, let's say there was no evidence. Brian had no idea what would work. Maybe he would do this experiment first before starting actually training to see what works, right? But because we have evidence to rely on, and in all likelihood, you as an individual, Steve, you're not that different from the average person by definition, right?
Like, what about me?
Also, likely not that different from the average person. Maybe a bit balder. That's about it.
I'm not bald. I shave. That's a reference for only a few.
Gotcha. But yeah, so the evidence can serve as a nice starting point, because in all likelihood, you're not that different from the average person, and you don't have to go through that much trial and error.
And something I do want to talk about is, I think this was from UPAC. And by the way, that was well said, Milo. I think that's like really helpful for people to understand that further. But this was the point you made, Pac, was sounding scientific doesn't equal scientific. And you kind of had the sciencer versus the scientist. And I guess you guys as scientists, like both of you going to have PhDs, I guess it could frustrate you even more than someone like myself, who I don't have the PhD. I don't see it as easily and pick it out. I probably do to quite a high level, but not maybe as much as you guys, where people are like using science to further their case. And it's like, they're actually not being scientific in nature.
Yeah, I think you could be also somebody who has a PhD, depending on what the acronym PhD stands for. I don't know. I think only a few people know. Anyways, I digress again. But yeah, I think it's a big thing in our field, man, and especially with not just evidence-based practitioners, but just practitioners that are trying to make themselves sound much more scientific about something that it needs. So like a true scientist, and when you start writing scientific papers, like it really goes away from the typical school method or undergraduate method, where you're just trying to add as many words as possible to a sentence to make it sound as extreme as complicated as possible. It's like you have to be as straightforward as possible. So in our field, you often hear a lot of jargon and a lot of absolute statements sprinkled with words like data or the literature, as well as, saying periodization, for example, when talking about planning your training. Periodization is a legit concept, but it can be used as a bit of a jargon word, and can often lead to people thinking that, whoa, science-based training is this sort of super complicated venture, and you have to like really, really know your stuff, when in reality it's just regular training, regular hard training with a few variables optimized, and an open mind to change when new evidence comes out. So whenever you see somebody making things extremely complicated, unless they are, on a podcast talking with other scientists, or it's a really complex issue, maybe looking at hypertrophy at the molecular level, when it sounds extremely complicated, I think you ought to be somewhat skeptical, especially if the goal, if the goal of the podcast or the post that you're reading is to inform you, if that makes sense.
And the interesting
go for it. No, you go for it.
You flatter me. And the interesting thing as well, and the sad thing, is that I think generally relatively well-intentioned scientists who are doing research, who are very knowledgeable, who have good intentions, aren't the best necessarily at science communication, right? So they may use too much jargon to really effectively communicate the findings of the literature as it stands to people. And then on the other end of the spectrum, this very much opens the door for people who have fewer scruples about communicating science effectively and with integrity, and more in it, for example, for cash, essentially. Like, for some reason, I'm thinking of Liver King. Like, you can definitely use science as a fortifying point in your argument, right? Like, you can say, oh, science has shown, even though you're not necessarily communicating with science, or there is no science, And so I think it's a bit sad that sometimes good scientists are unable to communicate their points effectively, and that opens the door for science misinformation or miscommunication or what have you. And it's something that honestly nowadays I think is about as important as doing the actual science, because ultimately, science for the most part is meant to be applied in some way, especially when we talk about sports science or even nutrition. Like, people want to get jacked, people need to eat and be healthy, etc. And so if we're just doing the science, but we're not communicating the results effectively, then that's a big, big issue.
Great. And that's what I was talking with Brad Schoenfeld here about, because it used to be, and I think it still is, a bit of a taboo to have either a following or be sort of, online celebrity with huge quotation marks as far as science goes, because it's like, yeah, like real scientists will look at you and be like, yeah, you're just, you're mainstream now, or you're taking the serious science that we're doing and you're simplifying it. But at the same time, the other extreme, especially in our field, as Milo said, is applied. If we're doing a bunch of studies and nobody, and sometimes even the scientists themselves, because you're not like, if you're working as a researcher and you're working full time, and most researchers will be also at an age where they probably have a family. You're not doing a journal sweep, or you're not looking at 3,500 journals every month to see what new study came out. So us putting that out there, even though for some people it may be a bit taboo, is very important, because then it may impact future research and also allow people to know their stuff. One of my clients who's a PhD who's a PhD and does research in hypertrophy on the molecular level, like some of the extremely cool stuff that they're doing, which is extremely complicated, and I we're not qualified to necessarily assess. Like, the only reason I would know about that stuff is by her putting it out there, which, we were also talking about. And she was like, yeah, we need to do a better job of doing that, because their research can then inform our research. That makes sense. I took it a level deeper, but science communication, I think, is very important. And it's 2023 now. We're not in the age where just posting something on Facebook or even a blog post is enough for people to know about it. Nobody cares. Like, us making even the memes and the podcast, I mean, you're doing a fantastic job at giving people a platform to do that, is important, not just for individuals who want to follow the practical applications, but for science itself. And as long as it's done in a non-cringe way, I'm not saying, hey, let's do TikToks. Okay, even that could be okay in some cases.
If it works, man, more power to you. You feel me?
That's true. We're not
topless
on TikTok
videos now.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
Hey, look, a fat, hairy, bald Greek man talking about a study. Report.
But I think I can definitely see how it's challenging because, again, like social media actually is mostly entertainment. Whereas like science is, I mean, it's science. It's like meant to be formal. It's like respected. Entertainment, like like they kind of don't gel together very well. So I think it's really hard to kind of ride that line. Someone who comes to mind who does a good job is Bill Campbell, Dr. Bill Campbell, who I've just recently interviewed, like with his posts, because he basically just like questions and then like gets people to answer them. And I think that's a really kind of unique way of doing it. It's awesome to have seen that that's kind of grown because people are inherently lazy about things. And I don't know, they see a post from someone like Andrew Huberman that says, don't know, if you breathe this certain way, you'll get rid of your hiccups, and they just remember that or whatever it is, and they're like utilize those methods. And it's like he hasn't even, like, that might not even have a reference for it, but it's Dr. Andrew Huberman and he sounds really smart, so I'm going to go with that. And this is where you get into tricky situations where people take science too far, even if they have like legitimate expertise in a certain area. They then try and explore that in other routes because now they're respected, and maybe that goes to their head a little bit.
That's a good example for the previous point about sounding scientific and being scientific. Because being scientific, oftentimes, depending on the subject and the level of evidence that exists there, can be boring. It's not sexy to say, hey, we don't really know. There's a lot of confounding variables. Research is limited. There's research that contradicts each other. And I haven't listened to much of the Huberman stuff, and I know that he's probably a net positive to the industry, but there are some claims out there. I saw one video talking about, hey, the perfect amount of time you need to exercise to burn fat. And it was, if you don't know science, it sounds super scientific and it's like, whoa, this is it. It's all like measured to a T, and you got to do 90 minutes of this heart rate range, and that's what's going to lead to this and that, and big words. But in reality, if you do know, you're like, not really. Which, okay, is not a bad thing. More people will exercise, but for a lot of people, it may also create that idea that, wow, this is complicated, and if I don't get my training parameters straight, I'm not going to see optimal results. When in reality, we can even just say, hey, make sure you're active and train hard, for people that just want to get fit and improve their quality of life.
To be honest, regarding science communication, honestly, I can't even really blame scientists for not doing a great job. You know, like, science communication in itself is a skill. It needs to be developed. And scientists, they're running studies, especially in sort of training studies, for example. Let me tell you, shit is time consuming. It's soul draining even. So you don't necessarily want to, finish the day at 6 p.m. or whatever and go and figure out a way to communicate your research findings in an attractive way that will, resonate with people and actually grab eyes. It's a lot easier to just sort of write a blog post on a website that no one will ever read, unfortunately. And so I think it's the sort of thing where scientists aren't really often incentivized nowadays to communicate research very well. And it's an additional responsibility, additional skill to learn on top of, running studies, knowing how to analyze data, having responsibilities within university as far as teaching goes and shit like that. So it's not easy. And I think that means ultimately that as a consumer of information in the evidence-based fitness community, in life in general, if you're consuming any media, I think having some critical thinking and like some background in sports science, for example, can come in helpful in that sense.
Sorry, just to add a tiny bit there. And there's a misconception because science is regarded so highly in society. And when you say, PhD or doctor or researcher, or lecture or even lecturer, whenever you tell somebody I'm a lecturer at a university, it's an instant, whoa, you are, the epitome of making it as far as life goes. But at the same time, a lot of science and academia is not a route where you're balling out and you're making tons of money. You're not getting funding for studies that interest us. That's very, very rare. And that's why I have a huge respect for what the guys over here at Lehman College are doing, because they're running a lot of projects just for the love of the sport. And at the same time, as I previously said, a lot of scientists, their peak of their careers or when they're producing the most results, they're in an age where they have a family, they have super demanding schedules at their universities as far as teaching and chasing grants and chasing this and chasing that. So people often have this misconception that, scientists are there and they're super comfortable and it's all chill. And running a study is just a matter of saying, I'm going to do the study, but it's much more complicated and it leaves much less space for extra activities than people really think.
I know, as an example, the listeners will know of, and obviously you guys know Dr. Mike, where he obviously was a lecturer and he was at a college for a while and he left that to invest more into RP. And I mean, I don't know if you were to look at their YouTube following at that time to where it is now, it's probably tenfold and it's completely exploded. And that just goes to show where he was putting his time, and he's now reaching more people. So clearly he made that kind of decision, right? I can educate at this kind of college or whatever and kind of reach this many students, or I can go grow our YouTube to hundreds of thousands and reach way more people. And he's obviously developed that kind of skill set to be able to go between. And it's just, I guess you have to make to use the term of MRV, you've only got so much capacity that you can put towards various resources. If you're even as an online coach, for me, if I'm putting all this time towards podcasting and producing content, my Instagram to grow at the optimal rate, but I've got my client work, I only have so much time in the day that I can do various things. So I completely see that with some of the researchers doing this, where they just simply don't have the time or, like you said, the incentive to kind of really try and communicate it in a large way. And that is why I have this podcast in many ways, to try and get it further out there. But even for me, discovering some of these guys, it can be challenging because they have such even hard to find. They may even not have a social media, and that's how I'm trying to discover them or get in contact.
Yeah. And names in our field that we regard as household names as far as scientists go, the majority of average gym goers have no idea who they are. And also Milo and I, just so it's out there, we're coaching full time. We also have a separate business, building an app. I'm the editor at a research review by Lane Norton. And the science is, obviously the studies Milo is writing now are part of his PhD, but a lot of all the other studies that will come out from our end are because we love science. There's very little direct, at least, financial benefit to those studies, and it's just for the love of the sport. Just because many people will not know and they will assume, oh, these guys are at some university getting all this funding and all this to run cool studies on hypertrophy and strength, when the behind the scenes is much more, hey, rise and grind than people realize.
100%. And also a common criticisms leveraged at training studies or intervention studies, running 10 weeks with people come in twice a week, 3 times a week, what have you. I think lack an understanding of how much work it actually takes and how little you're rewarded for actually doing those studies, right? As Pac mentioned, we're not out here getting funding for these studies. I don't really have funding for my PhD. I got some funding from Renaissance Periodization, actually, full credit where credit's due. But broadly speaking, resistance training intervention studies, you're not getting funding to run them. If you're looking at hypertrophy and strength specifically, especially for general health stuff, yeah, you could as part of a public health grant. But generally, you're not getting any funding. You're having people in 2 to 3 times a week for, say, 6 to 12 weeks, only then for someone online to tell you, hey, why wasn't that study 6 months long? And it's well, I did it as a labor of love, I'm not getting paid for this. I'm not really like, universities don't really look at you and say, oh, okay, but how many resistance training studies have you done? They don't look at that when they're trying to promote you usually. So yeah, I think it's more work than people realize, especially within exercise science as opposed to sort of public health. And it's less rewarding or less lucrative as well than people realize. So that's worth keeping in mind next time you see a study and you're about to say, hey, why didn't this have 200 people in the study?
Like the Delos study, the I'm helping out with here at Lehman College, led by Max Coleman, and it's Brad Schoenfeld's group essentially running the study. They have, I'd say, 8, at least 6, but close to 10 students, master students, helping out with data collection. Around 50 subjects coming into the lab 3 days a week to be put through hard resistance training sessions. And that's another criticism that, they didn't train hard enough. Like, they're definitely training hard enough. And to coordinate that, if you're, and that's because Brad is somebody who loves doing the research. He's not required to run these cool studies, but like, in order for that study to run, and it's a study on deloads, which is essentially 9 weeks long. One group is going to train super hard for 4 weeks, take a deload, then continue training for 4 weeks. The other group will just train throughout the whole 9 weeks. I can already see people saying, "Oh yeah, it wasn't perfect," and in the real world, not everybody will need a deload here and there. But like, the logistics behind running such a study, especially in any other environment than the one here, where there's a ton of enthusiastic people about this, and there's somebody also giving them the incentive to run these studies with getting them out there and publication and so on and so forth. Like, it's insane. And a lot of universities, even on the PhD level, you'll see PhDs who will finish their PhD with not many publications because they don't have a supervisor that will create that environment. And even in our own university in the UK, if we didn't take the lead or initiative on running studies and projects and systematic reviews and this and that, nobody from the university, aside from our respective supervisors, would actually say, hey, Milo and Pac, come and we'll give you undergrad students to help you with data collection or the lab or this and that. Sometimes it's even the opposite.
It's kind of crazy when you put it like that, because the incentives just aren't there. It's almost a personal pursuit and passion. I guess some people could say you're playing the long game, like with Milo.
It is the long game.
Your PhD, and eventually that's going to lead to you being able to, have more clients, charge more, whatever. And maybe there is some to that, but like, to the level you're taking it, probably you could make more money, especially in the short term, but even potentially longer term, if you just decided, right, I'm just going to go into like social media and spend my time coaching more people.
Absolutely.
As soon as you have the credentials, so as soon as Milo finishes his PhD, and Mike is a really good example of that. Mike is not there, and I'm not saying that as a bad thing. Mike Israel has his PhD, and he's published a few papers and will be involved in some publications, but he's done enough as far as science goes for the layman and even people with degrees who continue to do science to be like, okay, the guy has done a PhD, has published some research. Nobody's going to tell Milo or myself, hey guys, why do you only have 20 publications and not 85? Especially after finishing a PhD. So yeah, Milo,
100%. I do think with further education, for example, to sports science, as you mentioned, there is a huge opportunity cost. So as much as I might sometimes recommend, if you're really interested in sports science or coaching at a high level, you might want to consider getting an undergrad or even a master or even a PhD. I do think the opportunity cost is not to be underestimated, because we're not just talking about, say, tuition fees, right? Which can definitely add up. Like in the UK, for example, for an undergraduate degree in sports science, you're talking £30,000 or about maybe $35,000 in tuition fees alone. That's excluding like accommodation and other expenses. But then on top of that, you also have the huge opportunity cost of time invested, right? We're talking about years of your life. Like right now, if I wasn't doing my PhD, I would have an extra, probably like 20 or 30 hours a week, that I could probably use. And I could use that to spend more time on social media, make better posts, do that sort of stuff. So yes, there is definitely a payoff in terms of credibility at the end of it. Like if you have a PhD, I think generally people value your opinion more or take you more seriously, etc. But I think the opportunity cost is not to be underestimated. And one thing I think people can fall into, and to be honest, this is something I've seen Andrew Huberman, for example, can fall into, is when people take you seriously or see you as a credible source or someone with authority on a topic, they will generally also take your opinion on other matters that you might not be as qualified to speak about very seriously. And that's where it's important as an academic, as a scientist, as someone with integrity, to not overextend. If you don't have much confidence on a topic, say so. If there is not much evidence to support your stance, say so. The reason I'm very comfortable talking about range of motion and muscle length, for example, is because I think I'm amongst the people who know the most about this topic. And so if there's anyone who should probably talk about it, it's probably me, right? But then with other stuff, generally, unless I know my stuff, I'll definitely be more reserved. Like even within sports science, even within lifting, even within hypertrophy research, there are topics where I'll be like, yeah, I don't really know, like I couldn't tell you. So when someone gets a big following or gets seen as someone with authority, it's important to say, hey, I don't have much knowledge in this area. I'm not qualified to speak on this, rather than say, okay, well, let me speak on everything and anything at once and give my take and make it seem as though because I have a PhD in this topic, I know everything else about every other topic. That's not how you should conduct yourself as someone with a PhD. And I kind of think that the PhD process or studying in general should and usually does teach you that humility. Like because you spend so much time on a single topic or on a single field even, generally by the end of it, you should know that, all right, I know a lot about this stuff that I didn't know before. I realize how much depth there is here, how much breadth there is here. That means that I can't really speak on anything else, right? Like if I realize how complex things can get, I shouldn't really be speaking about anything else as if I really know my stuff. And that can also, I think that alone can help you pick your sources a lot more carefully. Like that fact alone that you understand how much goes into knowing something quite well, that can make you a bit more skeptical, a bit more of a critical thinker about what people will tell you and how to evaluate information sources. So I think there are definitely pros to getting higher education in sports science, no doubt. But I think that it's a decision with a big opportunity cost, and it should be considered carefully. And I think if you do go that route, be careful not to overextend beyond what you're qualified to speak about.
Yeah. And Greg Knuckles had I think posted on social media about how many people click on the citations on each Stronger by Science article, and like almost nobody does. So imagine you being a PhD with a large following. So large following, that by itself equals credibility. PhD, especially for the layperson, and in certain cultures, it's like, wow, you know everything. And unless you're making an extremely unorthodox claims, and you just sprinkle the world's literature or there's data or whatever, people are not going to be like, oh, okay, let me do a systematic review now, or let me just open up PubMed and try and find all the studies on the topic or any systematic review and see if that makes sense. So there's a lot of responsibility that comes with great power comes great responsibility. Revive stronger.
But I think that's really well said, and I think you can actually use that as a consumer of science, or like this, when you're looking at things. If you see someone who is openly talking about their knowledge deficits and like maybe referring you to someone else, which I've seen actually that happens a few times with some people. Like I love that, because that proves to me that they're not just like, I don't know, there's some ego attached to it, when you have to have an answer to everything. And sometimes like I see myself wanting that, like, I don't know, with a client or something. It's just like, actually, I need to like not say anything now. I'll go away, research it, come back to you, or like direct you to another resource, because you're completely right, Milo. Like it should be the fact that like when you learn, like you go through the Dunning-Kruger kind of, like you just realize how much there is not to know. And that can be, I mean, that normally like can be debilitating. It can stop you like in your tracks, like talking about things. But I think, like you said, Pac, when you've got a large following, people trust you, they give you props all the time, it can be very easy to like just feel like, oh man, I am the man, like I am, like I do know this. And I don't know, you kind of I don't know what the saying is, but like you're your own stuff up and you're like lapping it up and you just want to keep going down that route. So I think that is something we're gonna have to keep you both accountable to.
Yeah, and Eric Helms had touched on that back in the day when I on one of the Iron I'm not going to mention the competition on not another podcast, but the fact that, when you get a PhD and you are out there in science and followers and this and that, some people will come at you and, on one hand, it's a compliment. They'll be like, "Oh yeah, you're Dr. Pack, the old." And on the other hand, I always feel uncomfortable. I'm like, bro, I don't know everything. Yeah, I did my PhD on the minimum dose for strength. We are in the trenches as far as science goes, and we're keeping up with the literature on a variety of topics. But there's a difference between keeping up with the literature and being an expert in, like, let's say, recovery methods. And I mentioned to Milo before we jumped on, hey, maybe we can talk about that. And he's like, yeah, I don't feel like I'm up to speed with all the latest research. And I think it's important for people to also realize that don't treat us like all-knowing beings, or because we're not. And like that pressure sometimes is a bit like, yeah, I gotta be super careful what I say here, and I gotta also always throw the disclaimers, which I do. But
yeah, and I think that's it's just, it just reiterates how important it is to understand, like, again, the limitations of scientists themselves, and like you've already listed out the limitations of science. And it's just funny to think how many limitations there are within science, yet people don't seem to understand that Anecdote has even greater, like insurmountable amounts, greater limitations to it, but they don't seem to put it to the same kind of level of standard. Like you said, Pac, with the deload study where you're looking at people like, I forget what it's called, observational, is that what it was called? Kind of that deload study then, like, but they don't kind of hold Anecdote to the same standard for whatever reason. So I think that's been really useful discussion.
Yeah, like our podcast last time about the deload interview study, where, like I said multiple times, hey, this is the first study to look at the concept. It's just a base. And it was essentially the ideal anecdote source of evidence, because like, oh, what do the best coaches in the world think? This is what they think. And then there was a guy commenting and saying, yeah, but it's just deload study. It's just an interview study. And I'm like, yeah, we said that. It is just an interview study. But at the same time, as far as Anecdote goes, it's essentially Anecdote packaged really well together, and it's just a base for more research to come out. Nobody's saying take that and run with it for the rest of your life. But yeah, anyways, I'm digressing.
For things like that, like deloads or peak weeks where there's been very limited like data collected from that, like I could see having that sort of like Anecdote packaged up from the best, like from Cliff Wilson, from 3DMJ, from like all the best coaches who are peaking their athletes to stage. Like I could see that would be an invaluable resource, because that's essentially, I mean, a lot of these coaches like Cliff Wilson, we have our like ebook, Ultimate Guide to Contest Prep, like the peak week part of that. It's like there's some science, but you're kind of like, you're having to pull from mechanistic data from like cyclists who are like carb loading or whatever, and you're trying to kind of pull from there. And like we don't have many like peak week studies. Same with deloading. So like to poo-poo on that is very short-sighted, but I can see why it's an easy target.
Yeah, and it's okay.
I don't know if you guys had anything more you wanted to say surrounding people who are interested in pursuing like a PhD. I know you kind of mentioned there are kind of costs and benefits. And I guess it's something as an individual you have to kind of make that decision for yourself. Is there anything for you guys that made it clear that you did want to go down that route, where you're just like, yes, I wanted to do this? Or equally, did either of you have any regrets or anything you do differently?
A supervisor was it was and is a huge point for anybody wanting to get into a PhD. My supervisor, James Steele, Associate Professor Dr. James Steele, PhD, FHCSCA, whatever the Fellowship of Higher Education title is. He was a big inspiration in getting into a PhD, and so was my mother, who did a PhD. But having a supervisor like him made the process much, much better. So if you're looking at doing a PhD, don't do a PhD for the sake of doing a PhD just so you can say you did a PhD, because especially if you're not in an environment that is a bit more, open-minded as far as approaching study design goes, and if you don't have the right guidance, it can take it can take multiple years. If you're doing it full-time, you may not, depending on your study design, you may not be able to have a full-time job, and it can have an effect on your mental health and quality of life in general. But just to back off a bit, if you really like a certain topic and you want to take your education further, and you believe that a certain topic is something that will is so interesting to you that you'd like to do a PhD, then pursue that, but make sure you find a university and an environment that will support you in doing that. And if you see any huge red flags from the get-go, it may be worth reconsidering. But I'd also like to say that a PhD should be done if you want to further, continue doing research or have one foot in academia, or at least consider those points. I'm not saying you have to, but if you have a master's and you want to be a science communicator and you want to be a coach, and maybe spending those extra 3 to 5 to maybe even 10 years doing a PhD versus working on your brand or your content or your whatever, maybe it's not worth it.
Yeah. What I'd say is generally you want to pick your researchers or your supervisors and not so much your university, right?
Yeah.
Who you're doing your PhD under will determine to a large extent your experience, I think. So you can go to a generally good university for a PhD and not have a great experience because the researchers there or the supervisors there may not necessarily have the same interests as you, or may in fact tell you that, oh, we don't have the facilities needed for you to do this sort of study in the first place. So I think picking the right researchers and speaking to them beforehand is really important. The second thing to consider before you say, okay, I'm going to do a PhD is keep in mind doing a PhD is going to teach you a lot about science in general, but it's also going to give you a very, very, very narrow field of expertise, right? Realistically, you're spending 3 years or 5 years or even more learning a lot about one topic and contributing to the evidence on a topic. That can be super gratifying, it can be a really good experience. And I think if you have a deep interest in a topic, that alone can make it worth it sometimes. But from an opportunity cost perspective and from a sort of business perspective, you could be spending those 3 to 5 or 10 years, however much time you would spend per week on your PhD, learning a lot of stuff about the evidence around a lot of topics and be a really well-versed, well-rounded practitioner on training, evidence, nutrition, science, etc. as a whole. And that might actually make you a better coach compared to doing a PhD. Now, what I will come back to in general is that higher education, broadly speaking, gives you two things that independent study won't. One is it gives you networking abilities. So it puts you in touch with like-minded people or people who are doing stuff that you're interested in, or other people who might be interested in similar business ventures, what have you. And the second thing is it just provides you with the infrastructure, essentially. And by the infrastructure, I mean both the infrastructure physically, if you want to conduct a study or if you want to do anything like that, but also the structure of, okay, well, here's the people that you want to speak to. Here they are, you can speak to them, you can learn everything you need to. We have all the resources you need to, journal access, etc. And that can make it easier. Now, whether that means that to you doing a PhD is worth it because of those two factors predominantly, and maybe the additional credibility and knowledge it gives you, compared to just spending your time doing independent study, which, no tuition fees, more flexibility as far as how much time you spend and sink into it, more flexibility as far as whether or not and to what extent you want to work alongside it. Whether or not it's worth it really comes down to you. And I think generally it holds true that the deeper you go into higher education, so from an undergrad to a master's, from a master's to a PhD, to maybe even working in academia to an extent, the deeper you go, I think the stronger your why should be, or the more specific of an outcome you need to be seeking. If you're doing an undergrad for coaching, that's a very defensible position or decision to make. If you're doing a master, it's still reasonably defensible depending on the context. A PhD, you probably want to consider the sort of pros and cons there quite heavily. And I think generally, provided you consider pros and cons and the opportunity cost, and you think about, is this really bringing me closer to the end goal that I want? Am I doing it for the right reasons? I think as long as you consider those and you go about it the right way, you can definitely do a PhD and it can certainly benefit you.
Yeah. Sorry, just to touch on the supervisor comment or who you're doing your PhD under. Milo and I were both very blessed with James Steele and James Fisher, not only being our supervisors, but also involving us in multiple other projects. So there are also people who are passionate about this. They involved us in many other projects. We got to meet a lot of researchers. I met Brad Schonefeld through James and James by attending another conference, and if we had the exact same PhDs, the exact same title under different individuals, it's very likely that we would be in a much different position now. So yeah, I just wanted to express gratitude on there, but also say that it is really important, because I'm pretty sure everybody has heard horror stories about PhD supervisors, and we were very lucky to have those two in our respective corners.
Hearing you guys talk through that also confirms that I'm glad I didn't pursue it at the time I was considering it, which was many years ago now, just because I would have gone in without that knowledge of like who's important as a supervisor. I would have just been going in there as like, oh yeah, I'm kind of interested and I think a PhD sounds cool and I want to get like learn more. And that's not a good enough why, like you said there, Milo, like it wasn't there. At this point, maybe I could somehow salvage something there where I was like, yeah, this makes like good sense. But it's kind of like you said there, Milo, where like I pursued growing the brand Revive Stronger, pursuing coaching career, interviewing like people like yourselves. And now there's like the mass research review, and there's so much more information out there where you can get like an expert amount of knowledge like spread across an area to be a fantastic practitioner. And I think it probably was the right decision for me back then. And but for now, like for someone who's younger listening to this, who's just like getting into things, that's some great advice that they could take forward, and it's something I kind of wish I had heard many years ago, because I think that will really help guide some people's decisions. And I want to say massive thank you for you guys coming on. I think it was a good discussion, kind of talking about the different camps and where people can kind of find themselves in the middle there and kind of think about science critically, and also some of the anecdote that they're also observing there. So yeah, massive thank you for you both coming on. If people want to see more from you guys, I know you've got your own podcast as well. There's a great dynamic between you two. So if people want to check that out and they enjoy this, they'll probably enjoy that. So give that a plug. And then obviously your Instagrams and any like interesting things, if you've got anything more interesting coming on. I know, Milo, your episode would have probably just come out before this. So people are probably aware of the cool study you've got going on.
We've got the Revive Weaker podcast. I thought of that joke before we started. No, Muscle and Feels is the name of our podcast. Milo and myself, we're both we're the two hosts with our respective. Well, Milo's cat mostly guest appearing because we shoot it over at his house. My Instagram is Dr._PAK. And I'll pass over to you, Milo. Thank you for having us on, actually, Steve. I should have led with that, but typical selfish guest here, just plugging himself in.
Nah, I want to echo Pack. Thank you very much, Dr. Pack. Sorry. I want to thank you for having us on. It was a lot of fun. I've got 3 things to plug besides the podcast, which Pack already did. One is my Instagram. That's at wolfcoach_. Wolf is my last name. I'm not called Wolf Coach because it sounds cool. Then the second thing is my website, where you can find coaching and stuff. That's wolfcoaching.net. And the final thing is, for all my research output, you can find me at Milo Wolf on ResearchGate. If you search Milo Wolf ResearchGate, you can find all my stuff, and it should be the first thing that pops up.
Fantastic. I'll make sure that's linked below. And I actually, when we were training Milo, I spoke to my girlfriend. And I was like, you never guess who I'm training with. It's Milo Wolf. I was like, he is the best name ever. So
for a sports science PhD, yeah. Especially, right?
Ridiculous. So yeah, guys, definitely check them out, and we'll catch you soon. Take care.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality, and we know how to do it, and we will help you achieve this. The Minicut Movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut Movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.